Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks to our panel, thanks to Netroots Nation. Thank you to all you virtually, wherever you might be, for joining us today to talk about the influence game. I'm Jonathan Geyer, managing editor of the American Prospect magazine here in Washington. And at the Prospect, we care a lot about ideas, politics, and most of all, power. And I've been publishing a series of articles called The Influence Game, where I think about corporate power and national security. And today I brought together Akbar Ahmed of Huffington Post, Mandy Smithberger of the Project on Government Oversight, Kathleen Clark of Washington University to bring some of these questions to life. And the impetus for this discussion, and a discussion I think is really important for progressives today, is that while corporate influence is deeply considered when it comes to economic policy or domestic policy, there's just too little scrutiny of it when it comes to foreign policy or national security. And the thing I've noticed in my reporting is a lot of people in the Biden administration during the interim before they joined earlier this year were working as shadow lobbyists. Sometimes this is called management consulting or strategic consulting. And what that means is they were working for corporate clients, they opened doors for them, they didn't walk through those doors with them. They were doing everything but lobbying. And the main finding that I've been thinking about is that 18 key administration officials, from the Secretary of State, the White House spokesman, Director of National Intelligence, they all came from a single consulting firm, West Exec Advisors. And they've represented Facebook, they've represented defense companies and banks, and tech companies that work on defense, artificial intelligence for the military. And I've noticed that because foreign policy in Washington is a pretty elite club, a lot of these people are friends and no one likes to talk about it. And sometimes people think I'm rude for asking questions about who you're working for, how much money you are making, and what you are actually doing. We saw this a lot recently with Afghanistan coverage, where a lot of former generals were on TV and they happen to also work for defense contractors, but that's never mentioned. They're kind of talked about as former officials. But the companies they work for rarely appear below their names. And maybe it's because these corporate roles are shameful. But I've been asking a lot of questions about it. And when I have, Biden officials have, two campaign advisors left their corporate jobs last summer. Jake Sullivan, who was working for Uber, Tony Blinken, who's been working for a ton of big tech and big banks. And what we're going to talk about today is, are these conflicts of interest? Is this just messy? How is it regulated? Should it be better regulated? And I don't want to talk too much. I want to bring in our esteemed experts. But one point I did want to make before we get started is maybe the most glaring example of this that I've been thinking about is Jen Psaki, the White House spokesperson, who's on TV every day, one of the most visible faces of the White House. She's recently been profiled the front page of the New York Times style section, Vogue magazine. No one seems to mention that she worked for an artificial intelligence company, Clearview, that does facial recognition and did facial recognition of Palestinians, testing their surveillance technology on Palestinians. Jen Psaki was doing crisis communications for them. And I feel like a broken record that I have to keep asking, what does this actually mean? But I want to share that outrage with you today, our Netroots viewers, our participants. We wish we could have you all together, but instead you're in our living rooms. And I want to share with you this incredible panel's views about what corporate power, ethics, and national security mean for the Biden administration. So if you have questions, submit them in the box. We're going to get to them in the last 10 minutes. We want to hear from all of you. We want to be very inclusive and include all the different points of view that might come up. But first, I want to start with Akbar, who reports on national security and foreign policy for Huffington Post, or HuffPost, sorry. And you've done incredible work. One of the stories that really stood out for me was about Susan Rice, who's a really top domestic policy advisor for Biden, who had all these corporate roles. But tell me, what have you found in your reporting on this kind of topic of ethics, corporations, and national security?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Jonathan, and for those kind words. Also, it is HuffPost. It's not Huffington Post, and it's definitely never HuffPo. So just to clarify that. So I'll sort of back into the Susan Rice thing. I think a lot about what transparency requirements actually exist and don't exist. And I think something a lot of us became familiar with during the Trump era was the foreign agent registration policy, right? So many people in the Trump orbit were these unregistered foreign agents and got in a lot of trouble for it, from Michael Flynn to Paul Manafort to many others. If you're a registered foreign agent for a foreign government, you have to tell us who you're meeting, what you're sharing with them, what issues you're working on, and do a lot. If you're Susan Rice or Jen Psaki or Jake Sullivan, working potentially for foreign interests, not as a foreign agent, as Jonathan said, not taking them through the door, you don't have to do any of that. And that is a major gap that I've been thinking about a lot. So the Susan Rice example was fascinating to me last summer when Biden was trying to pick whether or not Susan Rice would be his VP candidate. I was looking at her career and found these years where we really don't know what she was doing. After she was in the Clinton administration working on African policy, she went to a private consulting firm where, according to a book I found about this very mysterious firm, she courted African government clients. She never released who those clients were, how her connections at the Clinton administration helped her, and then she rejoined the Obama administration. And this was an example of, these relationships that are cultivated can be used for personal financial gain, and then you never have to answer questions about it. I went to Susan Rice's spokesperson and said, will she release it? And they said, she'll follow the rules. The rules would not require her to release what she did 20 years ago. And guess what? She still hasn't. She now runs domestic policy at the White House. I think understanding the stakes of this is really valuable. And to me, there were two big aspects of that. The first is when you're doing this kind of shadow work and you're working for whether it's a foreign government, an arms dealer, any kind of unsavory or perfectly savory and legitimate business, you can implicate yourself in human rights violations, in policies that are adverse to US foreign policy. Doesn't have to be a human rights violation, or just something that, a future administration or a future government policy shouldn't be linked to. The second aspect of it is you are essentially creating a conflict of interest where you're working with clients, making a lot of money, and there's a very clear understanding, given the US's two-party system, that you're in today, out tomorrow, and what are you going to do then? You have to make a buck. So those relationships that are cultivated over decades for officials like Rice, but people at much lower levels as well, are extremely concerning because they can shape their decisions when they're in positions of power, actually using taxpayer resources and directing US foreign policy. To me, the case of Rice kind of made me think a lot about how reporting requirements, FARA, the foreign agent requirement, just are not enough, and how this confusion creates an environment that's so muddled, it's hard to have a real conversation about undue influence or accountability. This summer, 1 year on from the Rice reporting, has kind of made me think about that with relation to the United Arab Emirates, a very wealthy, autocratic Arab partner of the US, which DOJ is now investigating for infiltrating both sides of the 2016 election. Truly incredible to have funneled illegal campaign contributions to the Clinton team and to have an unregistered foreign agent, John Barrett, on the Trump team. There's been deafening silence from the Biden administration about whether they have ever raised this issue with the Emiratis, something that even Democrats, Democratic lawmakers, former officials have told me is extremely alarming. They should at least say, we see this and we know what's happening, don't do it again. Instead, you see many officials who we know have worked for firms that have business with the Emiratis, not necessarily as foreign agents, not necessarily registered, not saying a thing about it. And those are the kind of questions that I think we should be extremely alarmed about.
No, those are great questions, Akbar. And I think the thing that really resonates for me, and I want to bring Kathleen in, I know she has a lot to say on this matter, that public disclosures provide an incomplete picture. I mean, consultancies don't reveal their clients unless they have to. Corporations don't reveal who's consulting for them unless they have to. And you never really know what they're doing. It's a line item. Everything's mandated by Congress, these kind of Office of Government Ethics forms that Kathleen and I have talked about before really just give you a real snapshot of a line item and a quite incomplete picture. So Kathleen, you're an expert on ethics. Tell us about that. What are the issues here?
Yeah, thanks. And what I want to focus on is not so much the disclosure requirements and the limitations on disclosure, but frankly, the limitations and the inadequacies of our revolving door restrictions as such. So I've written about government ethics standards and have even asserted that, in some cases it seems like we have too many ethics standards. But in this area of the revolving door, I think they do not adequately capture a concern that is, I think, coming to the fore in news articles and investigations, and is, I think, partially the subject of this panel. And that is the fact that the most government ethics standards focus narrowly on the time when someone is actually in the government. This is understandable. That would be the primary focus. There are very few ethics rules that look at or are based on, that are triggered by what someone has done prior to being in government. And there are a few more, but again, they're really narrowly drawn restrictions that impose limits on what you can do after you leave government. So I basically made a list of federal ethics standards that apply to executive branch officials. And as I say, most of them are limited to while someone is in government, restrictions on outside employment, financial interests, outside compensation, and so on. And those are legitimate concerns. On the post-employment front, again, we have narrow restrictions. We have a permanent bar on communicating back to a government official on a matter if the official participated on that matter while in government, and a 2-year bar if the matter was under someone's responsibility. But again, those restrictions only apply to communications back to government and don't limit someone's ability, as a matter of federal law, to aid and advise a party, a company, a contractor, say, who is affected by that work. And then there are some additional restrictions on very high level appointees. But again, those only apply for a year or two after you leave government. And similarly, there are just 1 or 2 regulations that limit what someone can do in government based on their immediate prior employer or what they were doing, in the year before they came into government. But for many government officials, and in particular for political appointees, as Akbar, I think, alluded to, time in government is just one part of a decades-long career arc. And when we think about how such an official may be influenced, it makes sense to focus not just on the narrow time period while they are in government, but also what pernicious effects may come from what they have done in the past, not just 1 or 2 years in the past, and what they might do in the future, and not just 1 or 2 years in the future. But I think we need to somehow account for this career arc, particularly when it comes to political appointees. And so while there are a few, pre-employment and post-employment revolving door restrictions, none of them really grapple with this broader career arc concern. And I guess I just want to, in addition to the shadow lobbying issue, I just want to sort of point to a New York Times article from last month, I think around the 19th of September, about accountants and lawyers going in and out of Treasury. And that's exactly the kind of career arc I'm talking about. So there's some really good reporting by the New York Times on that front. And frankly, our revolving door rules are completely inadequate to account for, to address the concern identified in that article. So anyway, I think I'll stop there and look forward to further discussion.
Yeah, that's great. And for anyone who's just joining us, please fill in on the chat your questions for our panelists. Now I want to bring in Mandy Smithberger, who's with the Project on Government Oversight. She focuses on defense. She focuses a lot on the defense budget, the role of defense contractors and corporations in policymaking when it comes to national security. So take it away, Mandy.
Well, thank you so much for having me. To pick up on what Kathleen was saying, so kind of the equivalent of the accountants at the Pentagon is the acquisition workforce. So those are the people who are making decisions about what we buy and how we buy it. And we've seen over and over again how much that workforce is captured. There are some restrictions on what they can do based on how much they've been personally involved in a program, but there are huge loopholes, as Kathleen is talking about. One is this division loophole, where it's okay if you were working on a program that was a Raytheon program, and you can go work for Raytheon as long as it's a different division of Raytheon. And I think it's important when we're having this conversation to think about, okay, what are we trying to protect here? We're trying to protect the integrity of government decision-making. We want to make sure that decisions about when and where we go to war, what we buy, what our policies are based on what's in the best interest of the public and not based on what's in the best interest of the defense contractors. And do they certainly support and help us in a number of ways in what we're trying to do? Of course they do. And do our foreign government partners help us in a number of our missions? Of course they do. But we need to make sure that when they have undue influence over our policy making, that is transparent and clear. You know, going to what Akbar was saying about the UAE, one of the things that was eye-opening to me, you know, the Michael Flynn case helped me to learn about the fact that there are emoluments restrictions on retired military officers. So they can't go to work for a foreign government unless they get the permission of the Secretary of State and their military service. We learned after Secretary Mattis was confirmed that he had been working for the UAE. That did not come up in his confirmation hearing at all. That was not in his OGE forms. They said that he had told the committee about this, but I think that's something that's probably worth a question or two about what were you doing for the UAE if you're going to be the Secretary of Defense. And I think, as everyone here knows, the undue influence of defense contractors, especially on the Pentagon, is a bipartisan problem. It seems like everyone needs to have a Raytheon like lobbyist or executive be either their secretary or deputy secretary. And there's just this perception that what is in the best interest of defense contractors is what should be our Pentagon policies. And I think after the wars in Afghanistan, when we look at our ballooning budget, that we see over and over again that that's not serving the public interest. You know, I'm also based here in Washington. The main debate happening right now is what's going to happen with reconciliation. What are we going to do on infrastructure? Everyone's suddenly a fiscal conservative again when it comes to looking at these matters, but we've had very bipartisan votes to give the Pentagon another $25 billion more than what they asked for. So we can see the ways that these industries are continuing to have a lot of influence in what our budget is and what our priorities are. And so there are a number of measures that need to be taken to strengthen those laws. I have been really encouraged by how people like Senator Warren have used the confirmation process to say, yeah, I understand what the laws are, but those aren't good enough. I'm going to ask you some additional questions. I'm going to ask you to make some additional commitments. It's something that Senator McCain did as well. So there are ways for lawmakers to use their power through that process, in addition to really needing to make sure that we strengthen the laws. And while the Biden administration did offer a really strong ethics executive order, we saw with both the Clinton administration and the Trump administration that they got rid of those ethics executive orders on their way out the door. So we need permanent laws to make those changes so that we have policies that aren't corrupting our system. My other favorite factoid I always like to remind people everyone knows the Eisenhower speech about the undue influence of the military-industrial complex. Most people don't know that Congress held 25 hearings before he gave that speech about the concerns around the revolving door, hearing from officials. You had people like Admiral Rickover saying, I'm not influenced, but they go above my head. They usually make me want to buy something I don't want to buy. It seems like it's a little bit criminal to not want to spend more government money. So I think we are seeing the many ways that we need to course correct and make sure that we have a government that is working in the public interest.
Well, that's really great, Mandy. And I think what each of you have laid out, and it's something I hear a lot about when I'm writing about revolving door issues when it comes to Biden, which is, hey, this isn't as bad as the Trump administration. This isn't as bad as Jared Kushner. This isn't as bad as Steve Mnuchin or any number of truly conflicted officials who had, as Akbar and each of you have said in different ways, contacts with foreign governments in quite egregious, unprecedented ways. But I think the onus is on us as whether journalists or watchdogs or professors and lawyers to lay out for our audience and for people across the country of why that's not good enough, and that we need to kind of really be thinking about, what does it mean that members of Biden's team were advising the Israeli spyware maker NSO Group? That's really troubling to me. NSO Group, for those of you who don't know, makes Pegasus, which can hack into just about anybody's phone, hacked into the journalist Jamal Khashoggi's phone, allegedly before he was assassinated by the Saudis. There are new cases of the UAE using this in a really egregious fashion. And you have someone like a top advisor to the Biden State Department, Dan Shapiro, who worked as a strategic consultant for the NSO Group. Now, I'm not trying to single out one person. I think what each of you are drawing upon is that this is a structural issue. This isn't about one bad apple in an administration, but is part of a bigger structural issue. Does one of you want to jump in on how you see that play out? Maybe give it to Akbar, and then I'm sure you each want to weigh in.
Well, to the structural point, I think that's true, and I think, it's really, to me, talking to these people who are in these situations, seeing it not as something onerous, but really as an opportunity for more transparency and buy into government. Particularly in the Biden administration, that's trying to tie foreign policy and national security to this domestic faith in government, build back better, human rights at the center of our foreign policy at home and abroad. So, I'm sure you've all heard, talking to former government people, they say, well, I'm out of government. What am I going to do? I've got to have a job, got to pay the bills, right? And sure, everyone has to pay the bills. If there were a system where people could be more transparent and one could, as Mandy said, have that assurance that, okay, when you are back in government, we can see the paper trail of how you may have been influenced, what your interests and stakes may have been, we could have a more frank and open conversation. I think there's a lot of resistance right now. Lawmakers are always interested, but lawmakers then become lobbyists or become strategic consultants, and so do their staff. That's where I think we have to do a lot of kind of changing of minds, because there's a defensiveness, I think, that's really strong among people in these situations right now.
And yeah, to that point, what I always like to point to is there are so many examples for these, many of these people have other skill sets, and so they can still get good jobs. They don't have to be influence peddling jobs. What we found when we looked at the top 20 defense contractors and who they were hiring and what they were hiring them for, we found it really was for influence peddling. Most of them were being hired as lobbyists, even though we always heard these arguments that, no, these are people with national security expertise, but it's clearly that they're being hired for who they know. But we've seen admirals become the head of cruise companies. We've seen how some of these other kind of senior Pentagon leaders can lead green energy companies. If you're a good manager, you're a good manager. If you're a visionary leader, you are a visionary leader that can apply to a number of other sectors. And so in some cases, I almost feel like I need to be giving them a pep talk. It's like, you have more talent than you and more ways to contribute to your country than you realize. You don't just have to be a lobbyist or a strategic advisor.
Kathleen, do you want to weigh in?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I wanted to follow up on, actually something I think Mandy referred to about how at the end of the Clinton and Obama administrations, and perhaps at the end of Bush as well, the revolving outward revolving door restrictions that appeared in an ethics executive order at the beginning of those administrations were then abandoned, rescinded, which is a good point. And nonetheless, I want to point out that those executive orders, that executive action, sometimes can be seeds for future legislation. If we look at, historically over decades, we actually see this, that some statutory restrictions originated in executive actions. And I want to point to one particular aspect of the Biden executive order that expands on an otherwise rather narrow restriction that appears in this revolving door statutes. So I mentioned that there are some revolving door statutes that prohibit very high or high level officials from communicating back to their agency for like 1 or 2 years. And one aspect, one provision in Biden's executive order, which I think is new, I'm not sure, but I don't think it was in Obama's, prohibits those same officials from materially assisting others in making communications or appearances that those officials would themselves be prohibited from doing personally by statute. So that's an innovation. It's a significant, I think, expansion. And it's an example of looking at like how narrowly drawn the statutes are and looking at a way to expand them so that they reach the kind of concern that we have, not just that someone's presence, a former official's presence, will influence improperly a government official, but also that person may have insights that somehow belong to the public and not that shouldn't be used for private gain on behalf of a client by materially assisting them in their strategy of lobbying, engaging in shadow lobbying in that way. So I just want to point out that there may be ways to mine the executive orders for innovations that could then be put into statute.
Well, I think that's a great point. One thing I really wanted to kind of pose to the three of you is, part of this is about appearance of conflicts, and part of this is about actual conflicts. So I think there's the appearance of capture when you have 18 consultants from a single firm run by the Secretary of State going to government. That doesn't mean it's actually a problem, it just smells bad. Or it could be an appearance of conflict that the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was in Raytheon, was involved in a SPAC, Pine Island Capital Partners, which is investing in tech and defense technologies that are going to be very helpful in battling COVID. There's a whole layers and layers of appearances of conflict. But as a journalist, I'm also looking always for that aha moment of where's the actual conflict? And I've kind of identified a few that I think are quite fishy. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, was a personal advisor to the Microsoft executive. Microsoft has a big hack within weeks of the administration starting, and he's got to clean up the security mess for a company he used to advise. But I wonder if each of you have ideas of things you saw that are either particularly messy in our conflicts, or whether the appearance of conflict is enough to situate these within ethical quandaries. So maybe Mandy, do you want to go first, or is something come to mind there for you?
Yeah, I have a couple of examples. So one, you have General Joe Dunford, who was the commandant of the Marine Corps, helped save the F-35 program when it was looking pretty bad, approving it for a major milestone. After he left the military, he joined the board of Lockheed Martin, which is the prime contractor for the F-35 program. Another one that I always love for the visual, I don't know if you all remember when there was that blimp that got away and there was a picture of it next to a buggy. So that was a program the Army was dying to kill and cut off. And you had General Cartwright save that program from being canceled, and he joined the board of Raytheon afterwards, which was the prime contractor for that one. In a lot of these cases, not illegal at all, but it sure doesn't smell right. And I think it's also like a good example to remember how destructive even that appearance can be when you look at the Department of Defense was trying to acquire had a $10 billion cloud computing program that they were trying to field. And the appearance of Secretary Mattis's chief of staff, having worked for Amazon, who was one of the competitors, meant that program just became such a mess and litigation that they ultimately had to cancel it. So a capability that the Department of Defense said that they needed ultimately was undone by conflict of interest concerns because they weren't able to adequately manage those conflicts in a way that could make sure that we had a program that moved forward with integrity.
Those are shocking examples. Akbar, is there stuff that's come up in your reporting that, and by the way, I want to thank our audience for filling in on the chat and keep chatting in there. We wish we could see you. We can feel your warmth and your energy, but keep chatting in there. So Akbar, tell us more about what you've come across in your work at HuffPost.
So I'm so fixated. I like how you put it, Johnson, of the aha moment and what is stolen from us, right, in a muddied context where murky interests are sort of flowing always, is clarity around decisions. So very soon after coming into office, the Biden administration responded to concerns from progressives, but a lot of Democrats, by making the war in Yemen a big focus and saying the Trump administration, supported Saudi in this horrible war, world's worst humanitarian crisis. We're going to do something different. And they did. They stopped offensive support for Saudi Arabia in that war, which included halting a $478 million Raytheon bombs package. Lloyd Austin, of course, is closely tied to Raytheon, made a lot of money from it, remains the Secretary of Defense. That program remains on hold. There's rumblings that, will it always be on hold? Will it not be on hold? And just having, to your point, that appearance of a Raytheon person, a huge Raytheon deal that they have paused, that they may lift up, just creates this really awful climate to talk about, is this about human rights concerns? Is this about business ties? What's happening here? So that's one from my world.
Kathleen, do you have anything on this?
I'm not sure that a red hot conflict jumps out at me at the moment. But what I would say, although this may be a bit of a non sequitur, is that on the disclosure front, I think there's a lot of work that could be done and wouldn't require legislation, but it would require a commitment on the part of the administration to ensure that disclosures of the financial disclosures of highest level officials are actually easier to understand. I'm a reasonably smart person, right? And yet I've been looking at financial disclosures for years, and yet I find them hard to interpret and understand, and I don't think I'm alone on that. I think there's a lot that could be done so that we have real disclosure. We have like fake transparency. I've asserted faux transparency. It's information about the financial interests and professional affiliations of high-level officials is made available, but it's not made available in a way that's easy to digest and understand. And we don't know, we may have information about their financial interests. What isn't disclosed is what their specific job duties are and the matters they come in contact with. And without that, we can't actually tell whether there's a conflict. We know there's a financial interest. What we don't know is whether that financial interest conflicts with their duties on behalf of the public. So I would just flag that as an area that really needs some reform.
I mean, that is just, I think you've said it in a crystal clear way, Kathleen, because I've been studying these ethics forms super carefully. Every day I check the Office of Government Ethics website to see the latest forms. And it's like reading Talmud. It's like you have to learn a whole nother language. And it's like reading between the lines and footnotes. And they've invested between, $1 and $5 million. Well, that's a pretty big window of financial interest that's unclear. And yesterday I was looking at one and I was like, this is 50 pages. How much? These tend to be between 5 and 10 pages from my experience. So when someone's financial forms are 50 pages, this is a huge amount of interest and I'm kind of freaking out. And how does this person have so many investments? I Googled the individual who's the undersecretary for personnel and readiness at the Pentagon, and he won the lottery 4 or 5 years ago. So that's how he had so much money. That made me really laugh because it's like, you wouldn't know that from the form, let alone, you don't know what Tony Blinken did for Facebook or what he did for the, artificial intelligence companies. You don't know if the worth of someone's company can be independently verified until a year later when you see how much the divestment actually is recorded as. So, I think this gets to a great point. And I wonder, Mandy, I know you're really into this world of government ethics and the forms, and maybe our audience who we wish we could see, but we cannot see your faces, unfortunately. But maybe you can, tell us, government forms for dummies. What is in these forms and what do you wish were in them?
Yeah, so you both have talked about some of the top level things that are in there. So who they worked for, who some of their clients were, and that kind of information. This is where I really point people to civil society. So looking at open secrets, we have a Department of Defense revolving door database, revolving door project. There are a number of people who are trying to make this information more comprehensible and understandable. But honestly, it's probably something that we should just have a webinar kind of directing people on how to be able to read these kinds of things. And it's not just us. Congressional staff have a hard time understanding these forms and really understanding what all the interests are at stake. And I think it just goes to the faux transparency point. This isn't really about a system that's going to protect the integrity of government operations. It's almost treated as a paperwork exercise if we don't make these forms more meaningful and comprehensible to the public so that we can have accountability and prevent conflicts of interest.
Akbar, do you spend a lot of times kind of wading through paperwork and documents trying to make sense of what's really happening here?
A decent amount, particularly just covering the foreign side, right? There's so much of like information material, supplementals, and and again, it's not really comprehensible. And often what you'll find is you're chasing dead ends, right? So then to put that onus on someone where you are like, this contact was had, you go through like 100 contacts, and none of them are meaningful because the reality is also many of these lobbyists and foreign agents are overpaid for doing very little work, right? So they're not actually doing anything. But again, that onus is put upon a really vanishingly small number of, whether it's civil society folks, journalists, congressional staff, and it's not a burden I think we can really shoulder very well.
Well, I think what I've been learning, and I don't want to knock any of my colleagues in the news industry, but places like Politico and Axios and news outlets are really good at identifying where someone's working for. They're not all that good at connecting the dots of what it means to be working at one of these companies or why it's totally shocking that a lawyer for the King of Jordan, who was just exposed in a Washington Post investigation, that lawyer representing him in a libel suit is getting $1,300 an hour, which I don't think any of us would mind to get, but it's a little shocking. And some of them are just comical too, like the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. He was a consultant for Lego. I contacted Lego. I wanted to know what he was doing for Lego. They didn't reply to my request. I would love to know, was it supply chain? Was it about making little brick blocks in China? Is it something totally different? This is where it comes to kind of questions that we as the taxpayer, that we as people who are participants in policy in America, I think have the right to ask a lot of questions. And that brings me to our audience who pop in a few more questions, because we'll get to those in about 5 minutes. But Kathleen, Akbar, Mandy, do you guys have questions for each other? You guys are all working in this field sort of from different angles, and wondering what questions you've had for each other that have come up.
Well, Mandy, I want to hear more about Mattis and how he got. You say that he did get approval from the Defense Department for his work for the UAE, but didn't disclose it?
Correct. So we learned this because we filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the various military services, and that's where we learned that Mattis had been approved to do work for the UAE. But there was nothing in his OGE form. I'm guessing he wasn't compensated, and that's why it wasn't captured in that form. So again, all of these are things that would all be good to have had aired at a hearing to understand just what the nature of that relationship was. But by the time we obtained that information, you know, he'd been confirmed months ago.
One I would love folks' thoughts on from a media perspective. So there's a cooling off period idea for government officials. That standard obviously does not exist for journalists, who are often public figures and influence and shape policymaking. This came up for me when I was writing on Saudi lobbyists they hired after Khashoggi. One of the most powerful is a former Associated Press reporter with a lot of contacts, a lot of visibility, and a lot of airtime. You know, you also see David Rothkopf, a former journalist who is on television all the time without disclosing that he works for the UAE. Obviously, you can't mandate that for media. Is there anything, you know, Mandy and Kathleen, from your expertise, or Jonathan from being in media, you think we could do to have voluntary, you know, ethics declarations or requirements for folks?
Let me just jump in before I don't have the great answer, but I just want to define for our audience a cooling off period. In case they don't know, do one of you guys want to take that in answering that question, Kathleen or Mandy?
Sure. So many revolving door restrictions impose a period of time during which the former government official is not permitted to do X, Y, or Z. Usually is not permitted to communicate or appear before a government official. And it might be for a year or two, or it might be permanent depending on what their involvement in the matter was. But I don't know that I have an answer to your question about a cooling off period or disclosure obligation for former journalists. But I have seen something, I can't remember where I saw it, so it's not original with me, that I think is actually a very interesting idea with regard to academics, companies, governments, individuals hire academics and sometimes pay a lot of money for assistance on a matter. And then the academic gets to identify themselves as being associated with their university, which, you know, I mean, it comes with, you know, good, people assume that means there's a certain kind of objectivity and expertise, right? What I think would be a good idea is if academics were actually required, when they're in that capacity, to disclose perhaps to journalists they're talking to, or to the public, or to a court, whatever, who their clients are, who's paying them. Not just on this matter, right, whatever it is they're talking about, right? Because they might be talking to a journalist, but, you know, maybe they've been paid $1,300 an hour on, you know, by someone who has a stake on a related issue, and there is no, as far as I know, obligation. And so it would be interesting to develop standards. I can imagine coming up with voluntary standards and asking people to sign on to them. That might be an interesting goal, not just for academics, but for former journalists as well.
Well, this is, I think what you guys have all just touched on is really important, which is there's a kind of public trust in these roles, government being taxpayer funded and public service, but journalists perform a public service, academics perform a public service, and there is an expectation that we're going to comport ourselves in whatever one of these roles we have with some kind of ethics. And there is an understanding that if you're identifying as a Harvard professor, that that's your main source of income and that's your main source of, identity, when in actual fact, the board seats you have, even if they're philanthropies or if they're major corporations, that those ought to be identified. And I did some research on this recently, and I got a sense that universities want to do this, and they'll often have affiliations listed on like a hidden tab on someone's profile page on their website, but it's not crystal clear exactly who people are working for. And if people aren't paid, I don't know which of you just said that, that doesn't get captured in this. Kathleen, did you want to jump in on that?
I did. I just wanted to add another category that I think has particular relevance in the foreign affairs space, which is think tank affiliations and think tank financial support from companies, government contractors, foreign countries. I mean, there's been some good reporting on that, but that again is an area where there isn't yet the kind of transparency that I think needs to exist. And so think tanks end up gliding on these very nice assumptions about objectivity and expertise and disinterestedness, assumptions, particularly on the disinterested front, that are not warranted.
And one area where we're trying to increase the transparency is when those experts are appearing before Congress. Through the House has truth and testimony requirements that we've been working with members like Katie Porter, Jackie Spear to expand those disclosure. I mean, there are still loopholes there, and we don't have anything at all like that in the Senate. But I think there are some different areas where we can use some of those tools to help at least bring those issues to the forefront.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, Mandy. I was going to bring that up myself, that these truth and testimony forms are like a first step towards this. But I've done some reporting on this. The New Republic just reported on this. I know you tweeted it, that there's not enough enforcement, and it takes political will and enforcement. It's actually not enough to just pass the rule. So one question from our audience that I'm seeing from a bunch of different people is, what are good resources on this? Where do you all turn to when you want to learn more about conflicts of interest, ethics, how corporate influence affects national security? Is there a book you recommend? Is there a journalist or website or publication you follow? Besides all of your great work, which I would encourage everyone to just, Mandy's doing incredible work at Project on Government Oversight, but maybe if there's a particular report, what kind of resources would you direct our audience who seems pretty eager to learn more about this set of topics?
So certainly some of the civil society organizations that we've already mentioned are doing some great work. Everyone on this panel is doing exceptional work. We tried to create our report Brass Parachutes as a kind of primer for people to understand at least the Pentagon conflict of interest, and we maintain a revolving door database of senior Pentagon officials going to work for government contractors. I will also plug, we have a civic engagement program. So if there are people who are really outraged about this and want to be part of implementing those policy changes that Kathleen talked about, we are happy to work with you to advance change, because the message that lawmakers are getting here in Washington is that these issues aren't important to the American people, even though we have polling to show otherwise. So we are happy to work with anyone who wants to join the fight.
A few years ago, I went to something called, I think it was called Transparency Camp. I can't remember who organized it, but there were a bunch of workshops along these lines. But perhaps in the group chat, someone will be familiar with it and be able to, point out who sponsored it and whether it's actually still going on in these COVID times.
Akbar, do you want to jump in on that, or should I take a new question?
Super quickly, I have awful feedback in the background, but a lot of this will be segmented among various issue-specific groups. I would recommend, depending on the issue you're passionate about, the organization founded by Jamal Khashoggi, Dawn, is doing some really interesting work on who's appearing before Congress and lobbyists. I know there are other groups, Win Without War is doing some of this. So just think about what you're interested in, and I'd go to those civil society groups.
So another point that one of our viewers, Alona, brings up is private equity. And I wondered if any of you guys had thoughts about how private equity fits into this set of questions. We've talked a lot about defense contractors, foreign governments. We've talked about maybe a bit about finance, but it seems like, you know, private equity, it's something that we at the American Prospect cover a lot when it comes to the treasury and financial issues. But how do you guys see that fitting into foreign policy, national security?
So it's certainly an area that we are starting to learn more about. I think it can be difficult to do the storytelling, to be honest, to help people to understand just what is happening, but it's certainly influencing things like having less competition and more market and fewer companies to be able to provide goods and services. Certainly incentivizing behavior that is doing, essentially ripping off taxpayers, to be honest, like different kinds of practices that are making things more costly and less effective, encouraging fragility in kinds of systems where I think our, profit and public balance, balance has really gotten way out of whack.
Yeah, I mean, Akbar, did you have something on the financial front you wanted to bring in?
Just to remember, like, there are so many, when we talk about conflicts, like, there are so many reasons why a company that is not a defense contractor, right? You think about Uber, which has a significant stake owned by the Saudi Public Investment Fund. There is an interest there in maintaining good US relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So I'd just urge people to like expand their thoughts of who might be interested in maintaining what relationship and what deals.
Oh yeah, and I would say it's thoroughly bipartisan. And I think that's an important point to make too. And I think, the Trump administration was the outlier on some level in terms of its, ethical malfeasance. But there's this kind of steady stream of consulting firms that have senior Democrat and Republican lawmakers in their retirement joining. Is that something that you guys, I mean, I think this goes to what I was saying in the beginning about foreign policy, national security in DC kind of being a club. And, members of this club who attend certain conferences and write for certain publications, you're unlikely to see that dot connecting about whether those affiliations maybe inwardly or outwardly affect what they write or say or advocate for. Well, we have a little time for one or two more questions if somebody has a burning question. But I wonder, is there any other final thoughts that any of our panelists want to share that have come up?
I'd love to know, just Maddie and Kathleen, what marks you give the Biden administration so far.
Well, if we grade on a curve, the Biden administration, of course, benefits from the previous, failing, catastrophic, ethics catastrophe that was the Trump administration. I guess I would give it a passing grade, but I would nonetheless say, I'm disappointed in ways. And for details, I would just, turn to Walt Schaub's Twitter feed for how I am disappointed, because I share his disappointment that the Biden administration hasn't prioritized, disclosures, for example, the way it might have. So it's not a catastrophe. It's, a world of difference from the previous administration. And they can do better.
Yeah, I would largely agree. I think, as we've talked about, still kind of appointing the same kinds of usual suspect appointees. So some good policies in place with the ethics executive order, but still having a lot of industry influence coming in shows that it's not a fully realized vision, and not really working to make sure that we permanently fix these laws in a way, along with broader democracy reform. I think that has to be much higher on the Biden administration's agenda for us to really restore our democracy.
Could I add one thing? So Jeff Hauser had an article from maybe January or February on the revolving door personnelist policy, I think is the title of it. It's terrific. And I would say that there is one area where Biden appointments have been, I think, terrific from an ethics point of view, and quite a change, not just from the Trump administration, but from previous Democratic power play approaches, and that is with regard to their judicial nominations, right? Like, they have pivoted. You know, Clinton and Obama was all about corporate power, corporate law firms, you know, lawyers who had donated, lawyers who were bundlers. That's who got appointments into those administrations, and perhaps to a lesser degree, judgeships, and you know, where there was a lot of emphasis on prosecutors. And there are, you know, like, I think it's been decades since there was a public defender who was nominated, and now we have a number of former public defenders nominated. So that's actually a real bright spot on the Biden administration.
Well, I like a bright spot. What about ambassadors? Is that something you guys have been following? Not a bright spot?
Oh my God.
What do you think?
The former mayor of Chicago. Now that's a catastrophe. Right? I mean, the man was involved in covering up a murder or the killing of, I just, you know, I'll stop before I say something really untoward. But I think it's a catastrophe. So what could be more untoward than calling it a catastrophe?
And I think the thing I would just add on that front, you know, we focus a lot on the Pentagon, but there are lots of, as Akbar has alluded to and talked about, there's a lot of these problems at the State Department and on Capitol Hill when we were trying to expand some of these ethics restrictions in some places where the Pentagon has tougher restrictions on behind the scenes lobbying. The places we were getting the most pushback were actually on the foreign affairs committees. So I think that that is an arena that needs to get a little bit more scrutiny. While they might not have the same budget, they certainly have significant impacts. And I think when we need to look at whether we're achieving what we want to on our aid programs and our diplomacy, that we need to make sure that corporate capture isn't undermining our goals there as well.
Well, this has just been an incredible opportunity to explore these issues. I think if I wanted to share one final note with our audience is that, you know, this isn't conspiratorial. This isn't negging on the Biden administration. Not everything is about Hunter Biden and a mysterious laptop. These are serious ethical issues that we as educated voters and taxpayers care a lot about. And I often find that my reporting on these issues gets picked up by Breitbart or some of the most unsavory outlets. And I'm not very proud of that. But I am proud that, you know, we want to hold lawmakers and executive branch officials from the Biden administration to the highest possible standards. And I think that makes great policy. And I think national security, to take, you know, what President Biden has said himself, is more than just the military or the Pentagon. National security encompasses all these agencies and departments that, you know, you might not think about every day as being national security. And the one way to ensure really fair and impartial policies is by holding our policymakers to the highest standards. So I'm really grateful for Akbar, Mandy, and Kathleen for being a part of this conversation. I'm really grateful for all of you in our audience for chatting, and please check out Akbar's reporting at HuffPost. Mandy has been, you know, her organization, POGO, the Project on Government Oversight, just does really iterative, important coverage of this. So if you check out POGO, you know, you're going to like what you see there. Thank you very much, Kathleen, who is an expert on ethics at Washington University and has written academically about these topics. And you can follow each of us on Twitter. I'm Jonathan Geyer with the American Prospect. Check out prospect.org for more coverage of the influence game. I want to thank Jeff, who is behind the scenes, who made this panel digitally, technically excellent, and just Netroots for the opportunity to be here. So thank you for tuning in, and thank you for caring about these issues.